Book 2, Chapter 2, Marriage. The first institution that the domestic religion established, probably, was marriage. We must remark that this worship of the sacred fire, and of ancestors, which was transmitted from male to male, did not belong, after all, exclusively to man. Woman had a part in it. As a daughter, she took part in the religious acts of her father, as a wife, in those of her husband. From this alone we see the essential character of the conjugal union among the ancients. Two families live side by side, but they have different gods. In one, a young daughter takes a part from her infancy in the religion of her father. She invokes his sacred fire. Every day she offers it libations. She surrounds it with flowers and garlands on festal days. She asks its protection and returns thanks for its favors. This paternal fire is her god. Let a young man of the neighboring family ask her in marriage, and something more is at stake than to pass from one house to the other. She must abandon the paternal fire, and henceforth invoke that of her husband. She must abandon her religion, practice other rites, and pronounce other prayers. She must give up the God of her infancy and put herself under the protection of a God whom she knows not. Let her not hope to remain faithful to the one while honoring the other, for in this religion it is an immutable principle that the same person cannot invoke two sacred fires or two series of ancestors. From the hour of marriage, says one of the ancients, the wife has no longer anything in common with the domestic religion of her fathers. She sacrifices at the hearth of her husband. Marriage is therefore a grave step for the young girl, and not less grave for the husband, for this religion requires that one shall have been born near the sacred fire in order to have the right to sacrifice to it. And yet he is now about to bring a stranger to this hearth. With her he will perform the mysterious ceremonies of his worship. He will reveal the rites and formulas which are the patrimony of his family. There is nothing more precious than this heritage, these gods, these rites, these hymns which he has received from his fathers, are what protect him in this life, and promise him riches, happiness, and virtue. And yet, instead of keeping to himself this tutelary power, as the savage keeps his idol or his amulet, he is going to admit a woman to share it with him. Thus, when we penetrate the thoughts of these ancient men, we see of how great importance to them was the conjugal union, and how necessary to it was the intervention of religion. Was it not quite necessary that the young girl should be initiated into the religion that she was henceforth to follow by some sacred ceremony? Was not a sort of ordination or adoption necessary for her to become a priestess of this sacred fire, to which she was not attached by birth? Marriage was this sacred ceremony, which was to produce these important effects. The Greek and Roman writers habitually designate marriage by a word indicative of a religious act. Pollux, who lived in the time of the Antonines, but who was well instructed in the ancient usages of his language, says that in ancient times, instead of designating marriage by its particular name, gamos, they designated it simply by the word telos, which signifies sacred ceremony, as if marriage had been, in those ancient times, the ceremony sacred above all others. Now, the religion that created marriage was not that of Jupiter, of Juno, or of the other gods of Olympus. The ceremony did not take place in a temple. It was performed in a house, and the domestic god presided. When the religion of the gods of the sky became preponderant, men could not help invoking them also in the prayers of marriage, it is true. It even became habitual to go to the temple before the marriage, and offer sacrifices to these gods. These sacrifices were called the preludes of marriage, but the principal and essential part of the ceremony always took place before the domestic hearth. Among the Greeks, the marriage ceremony consisted, so to speak, of 3 acts. The first took place before the hearth of the father, engnis. The third before the hearth of the husband, telos. The second was the passage from the one to the other, pombi. 1. In the paternal dwelling, in the presence of the future bridegroom, the father, surrounded ordinarily by his family, offers a sacrifice. The sacrifice concluded, he declares, pronouncing a sacramental formula, that he gives his daughter to the young man. This declaration is absolutely indispensable to the marriage, for the young girl would not be able to go at once to worship at the hearth of her husband if her father had not already separated her from the paternal hearth. To enable her to adopt her new religion, she must be freed from every bond that attaches her to her first religion. 2. The young girl is carried to the house of the husband. Sometimes the husband himself conducts her. In certain cities, the duty of bringing her belongs to one of those men who, among the Greeks, were clothed with a sacerdotal character, and who were called heralds. The bride was usually placed upon a car. Her face was covered with a veil, and on her head was a crown. The crown, as we shall often have occasion to see, was used in all the ceremonies of this worship. She was dressed in white. White was the color of the vestments in all the religious acts. She was preceded by a torch, the nuptial torch. For the whole distance they sang around her religious hymns, whose refrain was Omen Omene. This hymn they called the hymeneal, and the importance of this sacred chant was so great that they gave its name to the whole ceremony. The bride dares not go of her own accord into her new dwelling. Her husband must take her and simulate a seizure by force. She must cry out, and the women that accompany her must pretend to defend her. Why this rite? Is it a symbol of the modesty of the bride? This is hardly probable. The moment for shame has not yet come, for what is now to take place is a religious ceremony. Was it not to mark more strongly that the wife, who was now to sacrifice to this fire, had herself no right there, that she did not approach it of her own free will, and that the master of the place and of the god introduced her by an act of his power? However this may be, after a feigned struggle, the husband raises her in his arms and carries her through the doorway, taking great care, however, that her feet do not touch the sill. What precedes is only a preparation, a prelude to the ceremony. The sacred act now commences in the house. 3. They approach the hearth. The wife is brought into the presence of the domestic divinity. She is sprinkled with the lustral water. She touches the sacred fire. Prayers are repeated. Finally, the husband and wife share between themselves a cake or a loaf. This sort of light meal, which commences and ends with a libation and a prayer, this sharing of nourishment in presence of the fire, puts the husband and wife in religious communion with each other and in communion with the domestic gods. The Roman marriage closely resembled that of Greece, and, like it, comprised 3 acts: traditio, deductio in domum, confarreatio. 1. The young girl quits the paternal hearth. As she is not attached to this hearth by her own right, but through the father of the family, the authority of the father only can detach her from it. The tradition is therefore an indispensable ceremony. 2. The young girl is conducted to the house of the husband. As in Greece, she is veiled. She wears a crown, and a nuptial torch precedes the cortege. Those about her sing an ancient religious hymn. The words of this hymn changed, doubtless with time, accommodating themselves to the variations of belief, or to those of the language, but the sacramental refrain continued from age to age without change. It was the word telasi, a word whose sense the Romans of Horace's time no more understood than the Greeks understood the word imene, which was probably the sacred and inviolable remains of an ancient formula. The cortege stops before the house of the husband. There the bride is presented with fire and water. The fire is the emblem of the domestic divinity. The water is the lustral water that serves the family for all religious acts. To introduce the bride into the house, violence must be pretended, as in Greece. The husband must take her in his arms and carry her over the sill without allowing her feet to touch it. 3. The bride is then led before the hearth, where the penates and all the domestic gods and the images of ancestors are grouped around the sacred fire. As in Greece, the husband and wife offer a sacrifice, pouring out a libation, pronouncing prayers, and eating a cake of wheaten flour, panis varias. This cake, eaten during the recitation of prayers, in the presence and under the very eyes of the domestic divinities, makes the union of the husband and wife sacred. Henceforth they are associated in the same worship. The wife has the same gods, the same rites, the same prayers, the same festivals as her husband. Hence this old definition of marriage which the jurists have preserved to us. Nuptiae sunt divini juris et humani communicatio, and this other, uxor socia humanae rei atque divinae. This is because the wife participates in the worship of the husband, this wife whom, according to the expression of Plato, the gods themselves have introduced into the house. The wife, thus married, also worships the dead, but it is not to her own ancestors that she carries the funeral repast. She no longer has this right. Marriage has completely detached her from the family, and has interrupted all the religious relations that she had with it. Her offerings she carries to the ancestors of her husband. She is of their family. They have become her ancestors. Marriage has been for her a second birth. She is henceforth the daughter of her husband, filiae loco, say the jurists. One could not belong to two families, or to two domestic religions. The wife belongs entirely to her husband's family, and to his religion. We shall see the consequences of this rule in the right of succession. The institution of sacred marriage must be as old in the Indo-European race as the domestic religion, for the one could not exist without the other. This religion taught man that the conjugal union was something more than a relation of the sexes and a fleeting affection, and united man and wife by the powerful bond of the same worship and the same belief. The marriage ceremony, too, was so solemn and produced effects so grave that it is not surprising that these men did not think it permitted or possible to have more than one wife in each house. Such a religion could not admit of polygamy. We can understand, too, that such a marriage was indissoluble, and that divorce was almost impossible. The Roman law did indeed permit the dissolution of marriage by coemptio or by usus, but the dissolution of the religious marriage was very difficult. For that, a new sacred ceremony was necessary, as religion alone could separate what religion had united. The effect of the conferreatio could be destroyed only by the diffareatio. The husband and wife who wished to separate appeared for the last time before the common hearth. A priest and witnesses were present. As on the day of marriage, a cake of wheaten flour was presented to the husband and wife. But, instead of sharing it between them, they rejected it. Then, instead of prayers, they pronounced formulas of a strange, severe, spiteful, frightful character, a sort of malediction, by which the wife renounced the worship and gods of the husband. From that moment the religious bond was broken. The community of worship having ceased, every other common interest ceased to exist, and the marriage was dissolved.